because we actually have somebody waiting in the rafters, for us because we're going to be discussing the news with a conservative. 1 second. Hello, hello. Can you hear me? Yes, yes, yes. Let me just turn on my desktop audio. Could you say something so I could just test it quick?
How are we doing, all of you beautiful people out there here on Dylan Burns' spectacular show this evening? How are we all doing, all of you glorious people within the sound of my voice? How's that?
Beautiful. And you know what? I've never had a problem when it comes to you and audio quality, man. I appreciate that because you know how it be.
Thank you. Well,
when you're trying, you're about to go live, we're 1 minute to go, and they're like, how? So what is a microphone? I've never heard of such a thing.
Yeah, that will happen from time to time. But well, how you been, sir? How you been?
Well, I've been enthralled with the news, as many other people have, and it's been a let's just say a tough year all around. I would say tough year. Not 2025. Not my best. Not my favorite. Would not recommend. 1.5 stars.
I got to say, why would you say that, sir?
Well, personally or professionally?
Yes. I mean, sir, it's been too long since we've talked, so I'm a little just curious. Like, I want to catch up with life with you for a little bit.
Okay, I'll give you a run through. I don't really want to get into the weeds on it too much because most of my community know it by now. But at the start of the year, my house burned down and I lost everything I owned. Everything from all my camera gear to my mother's urn to my pets to everything. And then a month after that, I had to bury the man who raised me. And then a month after that, I'm back on the front line of the largest war in the world. And so, it's been kind of like it's been a rough year personally, and of course professionally. I don't see any end for the war in sight. All the talk on the campaign trail about a fast end to the war seemed to not really come to fruition. And even though, of course, I'm not a big Trump fan, most people probably know that by now. At the end of the day, if the man can bring a reasonable end to the bloodshed that isn't like, hey, Ukraine, give up all your weapons and hope the Russians don't attack again, something naive, then, I'd be happy. I get to go home. I get to go back to Maryland, eat my crab cakes and, relax on the beach and, smoke a joint and, relax and spend the time how I want to. But instead, I'm back here and I just got back from the Konstantinivka front. And, it's pretty bad there. Aid workers were getting hunted by drones. The elderly and the disabled are the people who are making up, the majority of the residents now that still reside in these locations. And it's very bad all across the front line. And it's gotten worse this year. The violence, the hunting of civilians in Kherson has gotten worse. Firefighters, ambulance crews have been targeted. Sometimes they'll hit a civilian, like a babushka or somewhere going to get their medicine. And then an ambulance crew will come to go get them. And the ambulance will be hit. And then the firefighters will come in order to put out the fire. And then the fire truck will be hit. And this type of attacks have been escalated. The attacks on major cities have been escalated. Before, like a year ago, if it was over 100 drones going at big cities, that was like a big thing. Like, oh my gosh, 100 drones, that's a lot. Yet last night, I was woken up like 4 or 5 times because drones were ramming into apartment blocks that are just right there,
Last
night, 427 drones, 20 to 30 ballistic missiles. This is happening on a daily basis. And U.S. citizens were killed last night. 14 people were killed. There was a horrible report of these parents looking at their collapsed building as they were waiting to see if their child was going to be brought out of the rubble. And just the horror of anyone having to go through that. And so for me, both professionally and personally, 2025, not the best year.
Oh, I am sorry to hear that, sir. If it's all right with you, may I introduce myself to your audience in
Sure,
the only
K.O.E.
way
And,
that
and
I
some
may?
some people might not be familiar with you from the old hippy dippy days.
Those were the days, weren't they, sir? But folks, for those who don't know, it
Time
is
through the
I, Phil
hourglass. Sorry,
K.O.E.
continue.
Yes. Oh, no, fine. It is I, Phil K.O.E., the man of the hour, the man with the power, the man that makes the other podcast cower. You can, of course, find me at K.O.E. Nation on YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter-X, depending on your opinion on Elon this week. But yes, you can find me there, K.O.E. Nation, and all those places, very on brand. And me personally, sir, I've kind of stepped back. My best friend, Tony, he was giving me a hard time saying that I've fit about 6 years of life into the last 2 years, and it sounds like you've fit about 15 into the last three. So I've got a few questions about that here shortly. But me personally, sir, I'm a this last year has been blessed for me. I've found my wife. We just had our son. I was elected to the church board, so I'm actually straightening up my act, if you will. I'm not quite as wild as I was back in the olden days, but it's still so. Yeah, to me, life has been blessed. So I'm really sorry to hear about that. But
Congratulations on your child. And how's your nephew doing?
you know what? Thank you for mentioning that, because like a lot of people don't know this about Mr. Dylan here. Before he was Mr. Internet War Correspondent Extraordinaire, he did the Hippy Dippy podcast and all the fun stuff there. And he helped me raise money for my nephew Oliver when he was battling pediatric cancer. And at that point, Dylan didn't know me from Adam. He didn't know who I was. What, like, we had talked like for like 2 minutes once, and you still put on everything that you could help to. You just basically gave me the platform and let me try to say like, hey, go here to donate to my nephew Oliver. Now my nephew Oliver, a very aggressive pediatric cancer that was in his inner ear, we thought he wasn't going to make it. He actually survived. He just had his 3-year scan about a month ago, and thus far he is 3 years cancer free.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that.
So yeah, that is like it was miraculous, and yeah, it's. I pray for him every day, and everybody that was part of your community. There was a lot of prayers sent in from that, so thank you for that most of all. And so yeah, like here's the thing, Dylan, you and I are going to have some differences, but I know as a person, you'll show up for the right thing if it happens. And so for my first question for you, I know you want to question me, but I don't know how else to put this, but this whole Ukraine thing you've been doing, why? Because like okay, Doug Stanhope one time had a bit where he said some people say they like Dale Earnhardt. No, you don't. If you liked him, you'd say, hey, Dale, that's really dangerous. You should sit down and have a cold one and chill out. If you loved him, that's what you'd say. But you love Dale because he gives you that drip of adrenaline, so you don't have to get off the couch and live. That was his joke. But like to me, I'm like, Dylan is like, hey, that's really dangerous. You should maybe like come back to America and have a cold one. And so my first question for you, I know this wasn't what we were planning, but I can't help it. I must ask you, sir, what was the gravity that drove you there, and what is the gravity that persists you there? And with that, I
It's
have
good
to
that
hear
you
this answer.
separated those questions, because those are two different things, right? Because
I
you
figured we would have
initially set out on a journey thinking one thing's going to happen, and then other things happen along the way. Originally, I saw people get this war so wrong. First, it wasn't going to happen. That's what people were saying. That this it's crazy. The Russians have a million reasons not to do it, so it's not going to happen. And then it did happen. But then once it did happen, all the experts that said it wasn't going to happen then moved on to saying, well, now that it did happen, this is going to be over in 2 weeks. This is going to be over in 2 to 3 weeks. It's going to be over quick. It's going to be quick and
You're over by
easy
Christmas.
for the
You've been
Russians to
saying
move in there.
after 2 centuries of war.
Yeah. And now we're going on 4 years, so obviously those two things didn't end up to pass. And so I thought at the start of this, considering that a certain amount of people came into my community to see what I was saying at the early outset of the war. I always had an interest in foreign policy. I remember in late middle school, I was following the Syrian civil war day by day by going on social media accounts of the different militias to see if they had taken this village or that village. That stuff to me was fascinating. And so I was doing something similar to that, but now live in front of a large audience. And I made like 5,000, maybe $10,000, something like that, in a like a month or 2 months, which for me is a young 20 20-year-old, that's actually, that's a sizable amount of money to make in a month or two. And so I thought, what am I going to do with this cash? Am I going to invest it in my business and get a better studio, get better microphones, or am I going to improve my coverage? And I thought that in the moment, it would be better if I improved my coverage. Originally, I told my family, I'm going to go to Poland and I'm just going to interview some refugees. Don't worry about it. And I was like, well, Lublin is still in Poland. It's just on the border. Well, Lviv is in Ukraine, but it's like the furthest western. Look, Kiev's just in the middle of the country. Actually, when you talk about it, the Donetsk region, while we're the front line, and then I just got closer and closer and closer. Before you knew it, I was on the front line. And when I got here, a lot of things dragged me in further and has kept me here. The first thing that has kept me here is that I was shocked by how many things I had been lied to about, or some things that have been oversimplified to such an extent that I thought it was necessary. That's now that I know this, I kind of feel like I have to tell people about it. For example, I was told constantly by both Russian state press and English speaking outlets in the West that the language divide between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers was like one of the key big issues here. That if you speak, like, this is a war that has to do with the language, and the Russian speakers want to break away, and the Ukrainian speakers are oppressing them, or that they're not oppressing them, but they have maybe different culture, or there would be some version of this story retold depending on your leanings, right? And then I go to the front line for the first time, and we take cover from a drone, and they drive away, and we get have a slight close call, but not in retrospect. I don't know how much of a close call it was, but at the end of the day, I go to this training ground out in deep, into the east, and then I hear every single soldier, all these militiamen, volunteer militiamen, every single one spoke Russian. I couldn't find a single Ukrainian speaker for this volunteer militia unit that was fighting to defend, their home, their villages, their city. And so that kind of slapped me in the face. And then when I thought about it more, I was like, oh, of course, if I'm in Ireland and they say, hey, you guys all speak English, what are you, British? I'm going to get kicked out of the bar. I'm not going to be welcome there. And so there were certain misconceptions that I felt, now that I knew about, I had a responsibility to go tell others about. And then I saw what the war was. And this war is one of the most vile conflicts on the planet right now. And I mean, human beings are hunted for sport. Yeah, and here, son, that is what's happening. And at first I didn't believe it until I went there and I saw it myself, and I recorded it myself, and I released footage of it. And then the Russians released footage of it. And I think the moment that really stuck with me the most is when I was in Kherson after the Novakakovka Dam exploded. A bunch of elderly and disabled people were literally drowning in their homes as aid workers were trying to get to them, because these people are 98. They've survived world wars, and they're 98 or 101. They're like, they can't move on their own. Somebody has to get to them to get them out as the water is rising. And these aid boats are getting bombed. And then I go out and our aid boat was bombed. John Jones, my good friend, he gets hit in the stomach in the seat that I was supposed to be sitting in. And he's dragged from the shoreline. This elderly British expat who's here to help people drowning in their homes. He has to be dragged back to a hospital in Odessa in order for him to, save his life, in order for him not to die. That dude's coming back, by the way, because he's crazy. And it seems like a lot of people seem to have this syndrome of being a little crazy when it comes to this war. And so seeing that type of violence, and then having like the Washington Post and these other outlets reach out to me because they don't have footage of it, because they're not sending their correspondents to these places because it's either too dangerous, or they're relying on freelancers on the ground to come to them. And so I realized that these outlets don't spend the time and resources like they used to back in the day to put people with the Vietnam soldiers patrolling the jungle to show what it's like. They're taking the freelancers. And so I felt a certain historic responsibility to cover these war crimes and then make sure that they were documented, and that these different atrocities are documented, and these different battles are documented as they happen from the experience, from the eyes of those who experience them. Not from an overhead view on a map where it's just a bunch of fucking numbers, right? Which is how I feel a lot of times this ends up being treated. And then and this is like a lot of, I think, the historical meaning as to why I stayed here, some of the personal, but I also do have beliefs. And those beliefs have impacted my my view of this. Well, I'm sorry I'm going a little bit, but
Oh no, this is
yeah, I'm
great.
done. We haven't talked in forever. And so I believe in certain principles as, somebody who grew up in a liberal country. And when I say liberal, I do not mean Democrat. I mean
Yeah.
liberal as in we believe in republicanism. We believe
Allowance.
in a liberal style democracy where everyone can have their say, everyone can practice whatever religion they want. And Ukraine is a flawed democracy. They have problems with corruption. They have problems with, societal tensions and such. But hearing from Christians who have had their churches shut down again and again and again in occupied territory, there used to be 40 Protestant churches in Metropole, which is now occupied. There's none
Mm,
now. And hearing
mm,
stories like this again and again and again, because the Russians don't trust Baptists. They see Baptists as agents of the United States. The Russians don't trust churches that are not connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, which is headed by a man named Kirill, who said that if you go
yeah.
to Ukraine, you kill Ukrainians, you go to heaven, right?
Patriarch of Moscow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So seeing that type of religious bigotry on the ground and then looking back towards my country and seeing it getting very little coverage, I felt that even though I am not, I I have a I have this from one of the Christians we're actually interviewing recently, but I'm not a very religious man. But I still feel a compulsion to fight for the individual, not fight for, but document, talk about, give a platform to the individual rights of any man, regardless of their faith or leanings. And so I try to include in my documentaries the type of persecution Christians are going through, but also, of course, the lack of civil society that would replace what exists on the ground, on top of the fact that the Russians truly do not believe that Ukraine exists. They truly believe that the Ukrainian people as an entity are just a type of Russian, a little Russian, if you will. They're part of the Ruski Mir. The Ukrainian language is a bastardized version of Polish that they don't deserve to exist in occupied territory. Ukrainian books are burned. Ukrainian street names are renamed. Ukrainian monuments to the Holodomor, one of the crimes of Soviet communism, are destroyed and demolished. And activists are taken out, shot, tortured, raped, or otherwise brutalized. There was one journalist that was returned recently that literally had her organs removed. She was sent back with her organs removed because the organs would be signs of torture. And seeing this type of behavior so routine from the Russian side, it's something that I've become numb to. I feel that from a humanitarian angle as well as a personal ideological angle, that the Ukrainians are defending something of value. That's not to say that they're defending a society that is perfect, but that's not to say any society is perfect. Could you imagine? I couldn't imagine if our country was invaded by China being like, well, we are corrupt though, right? There are money in politics. Like, yes, that is true, but we always strive. It's America's more of a promise than it is it's necessarily a right here, right now. We have all the promises fulfilled of what the founding fathers intended. And so I think that there's a certain amount of grace that I think the Ukrainians deserve, a certain amount of dignity that these people deserve after struggling so hard and fighting so hard for their country, especially considering like previous commitments that our nation has made, which I have honestly felt a lot of shame around when it comes to the certain promises we have made to this country that I don't feel that are being truly delivered upon, whether it be recent promises by politicians, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, or by the Clinton administration, or by Barack Obama. I feel it has been a complete bipartisan failure between both Democrats and Republicans on the issue, even if right now the Republican Party seems to be the one that is less sympathetic to the Ukrainian continuation of support, I guess you could say.
That
So
is
I
a
guess these
diplomatic way of
that's
putting
a
that.
lot of it. I don't want to
Yeah,
ramble anymore.
well, thank you. No, no, no. That's no. I wanted to know that, and thank you for getting into that deeply. And before we get deeper into it, there's something I wanted to mention it because I couldn't help but there's a lot of parallels here. One of the things I really like studying is the fall of the Aztec Empire, and there was a Franciscan monk by the name of, I believe, it was de Sahagun, and he documented the different people that were basically getting wiped out by the conquest, by the conquistadors. And he loved the Nahuatl language, and he tried to do everything he could to preserve it. And at one point, his higher up said, send in your transcripts so we can see if they're heresy or not, and they were going to burn them. And he basically begged his friend, please don't send them to be burnt. Someone must know these people as I knew them. And I kind of get the feeling it's a little bit of that. Does that make sense at all?
I think that's true. I think that's true to some extent. I, because this war has become so partisan. These people have become kind of like a partisan talking point, and I want to make sure that when we talk about this war or when we talk about these people, that their experiences and what's happening on the ground here is documented. Because when I come back to the United States and I talk to people about the war, I get asked about like biolabs. I get asked about like, the idea that Ukraine had like biological weapons facilities that were going to
Mm.
like target Russian DNA, or I get asked about a bunch of stuff that, to be blunt, I don't think is that relevant to the war. I'll be asked about the Ukrainian Nazis. And it's true that Ukraine has Nazis. Russia also has Nazis. They have Nazi militias invading the country. And so that leaves you thinking, what are the Nazis coming to denazify the Nazis? Like, how is this exactly working? It doesn't. And so instead of prioritizing conversations about the persecution of people's religion, instead of talking about, the open hunt of civilians in Kherson, which the locals refer to as, there's not like a perfect way to translate it, but the best way to translate it is the human safari is how they refer to it.
Okay. Okay.
This is the stuff that I believe deserves more coverage. And so
Now,
that's why I want to focus on it.
A little bit. And it's something that I've been very curious about. Now, I can't remember the exact names, but like in essence, there's basically a Ukrainian Orthodox Church and then an Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And I'm not precise on what those are, but like there's one that's basically pro-Russia, one that's pro-Ukraine. And I'm oversimplifying it, but is that a fairly accurate?
Very roughly speaking, yes.
I mean, I understand, like, my great grandfather was Greek Orthodox, so I understand I am speaking in very broad and almost too oversimplified terms. But, and so to me, like, I don't like the fact that, because Dylan, I mean, you and I both know, you and I are very much on opposing sides on where we think this war should go. I think the sides need to sue for peace. Eventually, they're going to have to, because to me, my motivation, I don't really, it's not important to me who gets bragging rights, because both sides, like, yeah, Putin's an ass. Okay, we don't like him. He's like, I'm trying not to curse too much, but like, yeah, he's not a good man. He's a horrible, horrible human being. But the Russian soldier, the Ukrainian soldier, those are still people that are made in God's image, and they are his creation. And so it is a crime for either of them to be getting chewed up in the way that they are. And so there does need to be some sort of peace. And so to me, it looks as simple as suing for peace, and both sides, like, there's going to be some line drawn, and I have always jokingly called it Berlin Wall 2.0, where at some point they're going to be this place where we just have to play political hopscotch around for the next 20 years, and neither side's going to really get what they want in all of this. And in the end, this should have never happened. There was no reason for Russia to really do this other than just peak. And even the Art of War says that any war started in peak is a horrible reason to start a war. But to me, you're having God's creation chewed up on both sides, and I would just love it to end. But I know this. I know you're intending to interview me, but like, I'm sorry, like you're there, and I've got too many questions. And in a bit more brief, if you would, because I do want to. If you got any questions to me, I would love to get them. But what does peace in Ukraine look like to you?
Something that's long lasting, something that's stable. Because when I talk about this, my fear is that some people want a virtue signal peace, not a real peace. And what I mean by that is, hey, look, we got a ceasefire. Now I can turn off my TV. Now I can forget about the war. And then when it starts up in 2 years again, because we didn't set the foundation for peace, we didn't set up a security structure that would stop the Russians from invading again, or that would make it so it's such a disincentive that both sides would have no reason to relaunch XYZ, right? Without putting those things in place, I fear that what's going to happen is we'll have a short ceasefire, the Russians will learn, and then the Russians will invade again, just like they did in 2014, just like they did in 2022, and just like Russia has done for the entirety of its existence as a political entity. It has never stopped expanding westward. There has never been a moment where they haven't. Even after the Soviet collapse, Yeltsin was invading Moldova. Yeltsin was talking about, getting re-involved in this way. And so to hope that, a compulsion towards shared faith, or a compulsion towards humanitarianism, or a compulsion towards a desire to protect your people from this type of brutal war. And I gotta say, like, Ukraine has shown what the horrors of modern warfare to the world. I don't think that's enough. And so we need to make sure that whatever the peace is that it's long lasting. And so when I see, like, for example, demands like Ukraine must demilitarize, this is what I think is a perfect recipe to start another war. Because if you're still Vladimir Putin and you're still a revanchist, and we have no reason to believe that he's given up on that, a demilitarized Ukraine kind of solves all your problems for another invasion.
Yeah. Well, no, I would agree that that's a non-starter on the Western side, but like, here's the unfortunate reality. There's not going to be some scenario, unfortunately, where it's like, all right, Russia, you just pack up all your stuff and get out. Like, I just don't see that. Even if they just hold some piece of facile ground, because like, I'm sure you've read The Art of War, where they talk about the difference between facile ground and the active ground you need to take. Even if it's a piece of small facile ground that they fence off and say, look, we won this, it is ours forever. Then they can have their little bragging rights. But there's going to be some piece that's going to have to be sacrificed, and that's the unfortunate reality on the Ukrainian side. So I'm wondering, like, what is good enough for you?
Um, uh, Good enough for me. I mean, I it's kind of this
You're the perfect guy to
conversation is,
ask
is
because you're so
difficult
pro
because
Ukraine.
on one hand, my dream scenario is the Russians leave, is that they go home,
Yep.
they all hug their children, and then they can start to attend church, because Russia has historically low church attendance rates. Like, I think 6% of their population actually attends
Yikes.
church on a regular basis. It's very strange. Definitely when they're invading based off of what they say is like the defending of the Christian faith, or like, I don't know, maybe read the book before you invade other people. Um, but like, let's say
Yeah,
that
it
I
does
was to say,
violate the
for
just
example,
war principle of Christianity.
if you were to tell Ukrainians, and there's polling that exists on this, you can get back Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. You have to give the Russians Crimea. Right? You have the Russians get Crimea, you recognize it, but you get all this land that you occupied back. Ukrainians might consider it, but the Russians aren't in a position right now where they're discussing compromises. The Russians are in a position right now where they're still demanding, we got to cross the river, and you got to give us Kherson, the place where the human safari is happening, which would also mean crossing Ukraine's most naturally defensive barrier. It would mean them like overcoming one of their biggest strategic obstacles without a fight after the Ukrainians pushed them out of the city with force and took it back. They would need to give up the city of Zaporizhia, a city of 700,000 people, to the Russians. And these aren't like, hey, maybe at the end of negotiations we'll achieve this. These are the demands that they're putting forward as a starting point for negotiations, as in the Ukrainians have to withdraw from all these places. We'll take them, then we can have a conversation. And so when this is the starting point for this talk, when I think about like compromises, or, hey, maybe we can settle on X, Y, and Z, I don't want to entertain such bullishness and concede here, concede there, concede there until we're at the table and something's being treated seriously. If we tell the Russians, look, you can have Crimea, you can have Kherson, you can have Zaporizhia, you can have Donetsk, you can have all these things, can we have peace? Then what I think is the next step is they'll say, okay, that's a good starting point. Let's talk about Kharkiv. That's a Russian speaking city. Okay, let's talk about Odessa. That's Russian speaking too. Because that's how they've treated it every time. I don't know if you saw, but recently there were high ranking Russian officials saying, maybe to negotiate, NATO has to pull out of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They see the lack of response from the American administration and the interest that America has in not investing more into this as a sign of weakness that they can take advantage of in order to overextend their claims. And so, yeah, maybe I would be willing personally, even though I'm not the Ukrainians, and it's of course up to them to decide their own future, personally, to find some sort of compromise to end the bloodshed. And Ukrainians, when polled, also say they're willing to find some compromise. But the type of compromise that they'd be willing to accept is maybe they would give up Crimea if they can get this land back, i.e., we'll recognize that, we'll give you this international recognition if you give us X, Y, and Z back. That's what they, with strain, might accept at a rate of like 52 to 53% from the polling that I've seen. But what the Russian starting position is, give us all of this, withdraw from these positions, demilitarize, recognize Russian as the official state language. Like, these are all such non-starters that it's clear to me that this is just another stage for them in their long conquests to erase the Ukrainians off the face of the earth as a organized cultural entity.
Now, this is something I'm going to draw a quote here, and you're going to hate that you agree with it despite its source. This is a quote from Ayn Rand, actually, where in her book Atlas Shrugged, she said, in a compromise between good and evil, it's a 50% loss for good and a 50% win for evil, or a good way to put it, in a compromise between food and poison, death is the only profit. And I feel like that's a little bit how you feel at the moment on this. So like, yeah, like it would just be a compromise between food and poison. And so like I totally understand that, but like I'm to me it's like, okay, so Russia's probably going to keep Crimea, and of the areas you talked about, Russia's probably going to keep about half of it. Unfortunately, I don't know which ones. You know, y'all can, the Ukrainians, Russia can figure that one out at the table, and then the Russians can say, "Hey, look what we did! Hurrah!" And then, yeah, to me, you know what the Berlin Wall served for the Russians? It was like this weird psychological thing for the baby boomer Russians, aka the Soviets. The West was contained. They were behind a wall and contained. So if they can now make a wall somewhere in Ukraine, the baby boomer Russians will be like, we did it. We contained them. We don't have to worry. The West will not move forward another inch. And that's, to me, that's what I see the psychological benefit of this war for the Russians. I mean, like, I'm just trying to figure out why they would want to, because like, this does, like you were talking about earlier, it does violate the just war principle of Christianity. They just committed an aggressive war of an invasion, really, without like, I don't know, like, yeah, there was some provocations, we can get into that, but you know, at one point, like, Dylan, if you and I get in each other's faces, at one point somebody's going to throw the first punch, okay, and that's the guy who started the fight. Okay, like, you know what I'm saying there? And so like, yeah, Russia was the one who threw the first punch. They made the invasion. They're still doing, as you've said, a tremendous amount of harm, and you've been witnessing the horror of war, and it's something and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. I've heard it said, and it was attributed to King Baldwin, but who knows if it actually was. He said, war is not a test of endurance, war is decay.
I don't know. I think it's both, because the sad reality is, at this point, I don't think the war has any end in sight. I think Trump was very overconfident in his ability, and I'm being very nice here in how I'm putting it. Overconfident.
Appreciate
I mean, if somebody tells me something like, I'm going to end all the suffering you see within 24 hours, and it's now been 150 days, I have a right to be a little angry, right? At least from my position. And I,
Oh, don't get me wrong.
they,
I'm as a Trump voter, I'm actually quite upset that it's been taking this long because yeah, I voted for him for basically three reasons. No new wars, which that this week's going to be very interesting to see how that all pans out. Judges, tax cuts. The other two have yet to be seen. So, but yeah, as a Trump voter, the fact he said, I'm going to end it in 24 hours, and it's still been taking this long. Yes, that is something I'm very frustrated
even
about
said he would
because
end it before
we
he
want
got inaugurated.
yes. Now, even I, as a voter, is like, it's one of those like us. We take him seriously, but we don't take him literally. It was one of those. It's just like, okay, yeah, we'll
But
get you
even
in
if we
there, and then
say
when you get in office,
seriously,
you'll get it.
24 hours indicates a certain amount of snappiness that I don't think is being even diplomatically pushed for. I mean, like the 2 week
I can see
deadlines,
that.
right? Like, he
Like
said,
to
okay,
me,
this
I
is
think
he's
it.
put forward 3 2-week deadlines in the last 3 months. He said once it would take 2 weeks, and then we'll know if the Russians are serious. That 2 week deadline ended, and then journalists came to him and said, "Okay, so what now?" And he said, "I'll know in 2 weeks again." And then that deadline ended, and the last 2 week deadline ended this last weekend. And now, I can just look outside and I can tell that, that obviously didn't work. And now he says that the deadline is in his head, whatever that means, right? Which, as somebody who doesn't tend to give Trump the benefit of the doubt, just sounds like to me that he doesn't really have a plan. That he doesn't really have a plan. He doesn't really have a deadline. And I mean, it's extremely frustrating because this is what I suspected was going to happen. And on election night, I don't know if you were there on election night with me, but once I saw the results coming in, I was rolling these scenarios in my head, and I was sitting in my chair, I was clutching the sides of it, and I was trying to run like Okay, so how does this war go from? Oh God! And my end conclusion that night was this war is probably going to go into 2026, if not 2027.
Yep, because the funding runs out at the end of this year, more or less. I mean, like it goes in a little bit next year, but yeah, I don't see Congress approving more money for Ukraine
Oh no,
anytime
Congress, I see
soon.
that easily. I just don't see Mike Johnson ever willing to stand up to Trump in a way to actually put forward an aid bill that he wouldn't want. Congress, I think, would pass a veto-proof majority on new aid and the Lindsey Graham sanctions package. I mean, it's got 84 co-sponsors in the Senate. There's not a lot of unity in our politics over a lot right now, but there seems to be some congressional unity on the fact that the Russians have treated Donald Trump with a complete amount of disrespect that has not been responded to. And like calling him up on his birthday does not answer for the fact that they told him they would do a civilian ceasefire, then immediately bombed civilian infrastructure. They told him they would do an energy ceasefire and then immediately bombed energy infrastructure, knocking out power. They told him that they were taking negotiations seriously, and then they go to the Ukrainians and say, we can fight you for 21 years. Like, we don't even really want to negotiate anymore. And this is the way they talk to them while asking Trump not to be at the negotiations, so they don't see their type of really pathetic and gross behavior. And so, like to me, uh, asking the Ukrainians to concede more before we're even at the table just seems like kind of giving up your cards, you know?
I mean, I understand that, and yeah, I would be incredibly frustrated because, but there is at one point a difference between surrender and recognition, and that's something that people are going to have to eventually understand. Here is that you're to recognize that there is a weakness from certain positions, and that certain neither side's going to get everything they want. Okay, when the suing for peace eventually happens, neither side's going to get everything, and so the folks from Ukraine who say they want Crimea back, I think you and I can both kind of concede that that one's probably going to be staying in Russian hands for the foreseeable future. Okay, like that's a concession we both kind of have arrived at. Now I don't know where the middle ground's going to
Well, to
be.
be clear, what
You
Trump
would
asked,
probably be a lot
what were we
closer.
hearing was not that they even needed to just acknowledge that the Russians will hold on to it. They were asking for them to legally recognize the annexation of Crimea before they had even settled on the Russians like ending the war. So that's like concessions before we've even gotten to the table. To me, that's just bad art of the deal.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that,
Like
but
if the
to
Ukrainians
me,
going to be asked to give that up, they say, fine, we'll do that in exchange for you doing X, Y, and Z. That's how negotiations typically work. But instead, it's just been like a list of demands endlessly put at the feet of the Ukrainians, with the Russians being demanded what? I mean, they're told to stop bombing civilian infrastructure. They say they'll do it, and they don't even uphold that. So there needs to be a question of, obviously the strategy isn't working. Obviously the Russians don't respect Trump. Obviously they don't think American power will be flexed on this issue. Congress wants to act. Trump should allow Congress to act. Trump should allow the Russians to realize, like, oh, if we continue down this pathway, it's just going to be more painful. So we should settle something now, which is what Trump said on the campaign trail. If campaign Trump met current Trump, I don't know if they would like agree with each other all that much, because campaign Trump said, if the Russians don't come to the table, not only are we going to send Ukraine more aid, we're going to send them so much aid, it's going to make your head spin. And we're going to sanction the Russians so hard that they'll have no chance to do X, Y, and Z. And so far, that's been avoided. In fact, I read a report, and I don't know if it's true. I hope it isn't, but I think it probably is. But I'm hoping it isn't, because hope is unconquerable. That Trump's even currently telling Lindsey Graham to tone down the sanctions bill, like to make it less aggressive in some way. It's not the only thing action I've seen from Trump has been to undermine the building of pressure on the Russians, or to set a red line like Obama used to, and then immediately letting it be crossed with no response. This is, I mean, this is like the worst qualities of Obama turned up to 11.
now you're going to hate hearing this part, but Trump's voters will be very forgiving on even what you would perceive as complete blunders in Ukraine, because they just want out. Okay. Like it's just, they just want out of it. Okay. Me, I like to, I just see it as the more we pump more aid into it, the longer it's going to prolong the conflict.
I disagree with that so fundamentally, but I'll let you finish your point.
No, no, I understand that you would, but like it's just a simple matter of the more dollars that we give, the more that it allows them to prolong on their side. It's just a simple mathematics there. And so I know it's like, well, why would you starve the beast if you think that they're the good guys? I understand it, but the longer we continue in, and to me, that applies to any war, all the wars. I'm anti-war every war. There's a million Christians in Iran. My people are also in Iran too, as well as Israel, as well as Ukraine, as well as Russia. Okay, people who proclaim Christ, you are my people. All right, and so like that's yeah, I would like them all to stop tonight, but you know, there's hopes and then there's policy. You know what I mean? So now, why do you disagree with that? I'm very curious. I'm not like looking for a gotcha. I'm genuinely curious.
Yeah. So I again, I don't think like that you like don't care to the idea. Oh, a dead body is a dead, because I'll talk to some people who literally just don't care, right? And that's a position that I understand, even if I don't agree with. But yeah, Russia right now is the largest killer of Christians on the planet, and anybody who would like to see that stop is, I think, a sensible person. But the reason I disagree is I've seen it fail. I've seen that philosophy fail, because the assumption is, well, if we just stop sending Ukraine weapons, then Ukraine will have to negotiate. They'll have to come to the table. They'll have to come to some settlement. But there is no way that the Ukrainian people, even if the government felt like they were forced to, withdrew from Kherson, withdrew from Zaporizhia, withdrew from Kramatorsk and all these rest. By the way, love pipe smoking. Always want to see it being brought back. Withdraw from Donetsk, withdraw from the Serbinitsky force, which they fought brutally to hold, to keep some hold in the Luhansk region. Withdrew from all these regions, demilitarized, or fulfilled all these demands because American aid was cut. I think whatever government did that would see their leaders hung up by lampposts. And I'm not saying that to be extreme or to be like, but that's to say that the Ukrainian soldiers took back Kherson with blood. They've defended their homes with blood. A lot of these people are fighting day by day because they don't want to cede their home that their family has lived in for 300 years, the village. Like, their family only knows this village, and the idea of telling them to leave it is preposterous. That's why a lot of people wait so long to evacuate. They're not going to accept that. And neither should they. I think if we were to do that, it would just encourage the Russians to do it again. You give them a river crossing, then invading Ukraine becomes easier. If you make it easier for the Russians to reignite the war later, you're not really ending the war. You're just kind of pausing it, patting yourself on the back, and then you turn off your TV. And when it reignites in 2 to 3 years, you don't need to give a damn. I'll just say damn, since we go in the church.
No, it's fine.
And so I would agree to this if those aid cuts, or the lack of new packages, or the lack of new sanctions, or the lack of action from the last 150 days had produced less violence, had produced successful negotiations, had produced any success that I could point to. But I've only seen the war escalate since Trump's gotten into office and this strategy has been tried. There's been more drone strikes than ever. There's been more missile strikes than ever. There's new offensives into the Sumy region, into villages. I've met with the mayors in these towns and villages that are now frontline towns because the Russians are expanding the ground offensives into new regions that are not even in their demand set. Sumy isn't in their list of baseline demands. Kharkiv isn't in their baseline demands, but they continue to expand these offensives. So as the aid to Ukraine has slowed, or even stopped in some instances, as we saw with the aid cut and the intelligence cut for that period of time, the war has only gotten more violent. And so I don't think that the Russians respond to weakness with reciprocal like peace actions. I think they respond to weakness by saying, "Oh, your neck's exposed," and that's how they've acted.
Let me offer some pushback here, and I'm curious what your thoughts are here, because to me, I look at it that basically the European Union and quite a few nations are basically falling over themselves, just looking for a chance to put Ukraine in NATO. If they were to sue for peace, be that peace ever so base, even if they give up all 3 of the territories you listed before, then
5,
in that moment
yes.
they could join NATO, and then that would literally be the line that, like, now
Russia
I'm sure
says that's one of their most base
analysis.
demands they'll never give up on. They said they've like, I mean, everybody says, for example, you talked about Ukraine's provocative actions towards Russia. Now, I assume you're not saying that they did some sort of October 7th style, like across the border and like, but most people, when referring to that, they refer to the floating of NATO membership, which is an entity that was created to stop Soviet expansionism and is now most useful in stopping what? Russian expansionism. Which, if you're a Russian expansionist or a revanchist, as Putin is, that's going to be a problem for you. But I mean, that has been one of their base demands for a while, and Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO in 2014 or in 2022 than they were in 2005, 2006, 2008, or in any of these years,
I would
and they
say
still
post
did the
conflict.
invasion. So but they have made that like one of their most base demands is that Ukraine cannot join NATO. So if you can make the Russians accept Ukraine and NATO, then K.O.E, you're the best diplomat around. I got to give you a pat on the back. I got to praise you. Oh, hail K.O.E. But so far,
No, hail Christ, sir, hail Christ. But thank you. But now, what I will say is, well, then it would sound like basically the Russians need a lane to the ocean, because I remember Nate was saying that that's the big. A friend of mine was talking about how that's their big push, is that the Russians are trying to get to some bodies of water. I don't know about that, but like to me, it's like, well, okay, whatever lane they need, and then the rest of what's left of Ukraine, they get to join NATO. To me, that's good enough. That's peace. Be that peace ever so base.
well,
I know
mean,
that's not.
I mean, the thing is, that's already a hard pill to swallow, right? For Ukrainians, obviously. So imagine you join the army and you fight for almost 4 years, and then you're told, sorry, you're never going home, right? Because even if they wanted to get like Russian citizenship, due to the fact that they fought, or due to the fact that you might even have a family member that fought, people have been detained for much less than that for having a cousin that was in the Ukrainian armed forces. You're never going to be able to go home. You're never going to be able to see the village that your family lived in for until the entirety of what is the modern day Russian political entity basically ceases to exist. Meaning Russia would have to go through massive changes for them to allow Ukrainians to basically come home, just like the Tatars had to wait for the collapse of the Soviet Union to go back to Crimea, right? Now you tell these guys that's already a hard pill to swallow, right?
We lived through 2 world wars where we basically won the world wars and nobody lost their homes. So it's very hard for us to picture that. But in Europe, this is the unfortunate reality that they've been living through for, I don't know how many thousands of years they've been doing. Like where, yeah, folks are going to lose their home. Unfortunately, in war, there is going to be sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is a lot. And that's why I went before any of these wars. I say, are you sure it's worth it? Because now we're getting to the point where Ukraine's starting to run out of dudes, and Russia too. But like, why? Like, why did we need to chew these people up just because
the Ukrainians
leaders
have
didn't want
decided
to sue
that
for
it was
peace?
worth it to defend their home, to defend their identity, to defend their national sovereignty. If they decided it wasn't worth it, I think they probably would have given up like a year in or something. But they've continued to struggle. They've continued to fight, and even as more and more of their people have been like thrown into the combat. But if you're gonna, and I already disagree with like the idea of, hey, just let Russia keeps what I think it has to be like what Trump said early on. We're gonna negotiate for some land back. You get some land back, you some actual compromise, right? And Trump said that, and then he immediately gave it up. And which is again, Trump's entire game here has just been like interception, pass another interception, another interception. I feel like it's just been like that constantly. But if we're gonna ask the Ukrainians to make this sacrifice, right? Fine, but we have to tell them that this is the last sacrifice they're gonna have to make. That it's not gonna be in another 5 years. Oh, Zaporizhia's also. Oh, this is now. Oh, this is gone now. But the Russians won't even agree to that. And so when you say it's like it's as simple as suing for peace, the question has to be put forward: are the Russians interested in peace? Do they want peace? Maybe the Russian public broadly likes the idea of peace. They want some sort of compromise, but they're also not the people who make these decisions. Russian society is not like the American society.
Unfortunately, the Russian
society is
military
not
and
like
government
Ukrainian
is not interested
society.
in peace because they're in a position of strength at the moment.
Sorry, say that
Unfortunately,
again.
I don't. The Russian military and government is not really interested in peace because it appears that they are in a position of strength at the moment. So they've taken territory, they are holding things, and as far as they're concerned, they're the ones holding all the chips. And so
When has Russia been interested in peace generally?
Uh, maybe during the winter time, in the late 40s, and that's about it.
So,
I'm joking.
but no,
No,
but
no,
no,
the
no,
Russians
you're
love
pretty
them some
close
babies.
actually. I would say that's pretty spot on. I know you don't have,
Yep,
it might be a joke, but there's some there. The reason it's funny is there's some truth to it. That's why it's funny.
yep,
And
yep.
so my question has to ultimately be, right? Is it as simple as, suing for peace, or do the Russians have to be made to not want peace, need peace? That there's no option but peace. And for some powers, especially people who are revanchists, which Putin 100% is a revanchist, somebody who wants empire, who a revanchist is somebody who wants to take back territory from some historical empire. Putin 100% is a revanchist. And his demands don't end with Ukraine. I mean, like, this revanchism and the justification he put forward for the revanchism applies to Estonia, applies to Lithuania, applies to so many different European states. I think the Russians had to be made to want peace. And so if we want the war over sooner, we have to make conditions on the ground that make it so peace is necessitated. Not that it's kind of wanted, not that it's kind of painful, but that it is 100% necessary. You need to make it so that every offensive they engage in, oh man, we just ran into a brick wall. Oh, we just ran into another brick wall. And it might not sound like the small government option, but when it comes to government actions, military force and the use of the military is one of the few things since our nation's founding that our government was supposed to be involved in, that our government was supposed to involve itself in, from the Barbary pilots, from the shores of Tripoli, is not talking about Gaddafi. And so for me, we need to front load this investment. If we want to end the war sooner, the only way to end the war sooner is to front load it so the Russians see that their plans are going to be derailed. And if you don't, then all you're going to get is 2 to 3 years more of war.
Well, like, again, to me, like, if you can get whatever those lines are drawn and you can get a stop in the war, then what I know this is going to sound terrible, but whatever's left of Ukraine, you can now have that join NATO. And that is a way to actually draw the hard line where
But
that
how do
actually
we
is
even get
the wall
there?
of diplomacy and
How
the
do we
wall of
get even
a
there,
nuclear
though?
wall. How we get there? Well, unfortunately, I've kind of spelled out like the territories that Russia's taken. Ukraine's going to have to more or less sacrifice.
Okay, let's say we
because
do
that's
that.
where the line
Russians
is.
then say that's not enough. You have to give us more, because that's what they're saying currently.
Well, then you got to win that in battle. Okay, you can't
Okay,
just
but
take
how do
it
we win?
from
Yes,
negotiation.
that's a
We're
reasonable
at the
thing to tell the
negotiating
Russians. I
table at this
agree.
point.
That's a reasonable thing to tell the Russians.
When
They
you come to
say,
negotiation
then we're
table,
going to
you
do
agree
it.
that these are
That's
the
what
lines.
they're
I'm
saying.
not
They're
saying
saying,
this is
fine, let's
great.
do
I'm not
that.
saying I love it. It's like,
But
but
that's
like
what the
I'm
Russians are
saying, like
doing. They're
there is a
continuing to
time when
try
you're
to win
going to
those
have
in
to
battle. So you have
accept
to make
peace,
them know
be it
that they
ever so
can't win it in
base.
battle, right? That seems like the only option.
Yeah, a small force, they can give an obstinate fight, but eventually they will be overwhelmed by the larger force. And so Ukraine, they have given an obstinate fight, and like it's been said, war is hell, and they're having a hell of a war over there. Pardon my French, but yeah, it's to me like there is a point where they're going to have to sit down, talk, and figure it out. And whatever's left of Ukraine, when that negotiation is over, that's what you put into NATO. That's the only way to actually stop further expansion, because otherwise, it's just going to keep going into more and more battles for more and more ground.
I agree
and
the
then
Russians will
bombing
keep
piles
going
of
back
rubble
in.
into slightly smaller piles of rubble. Like
I agree that the Russians keep going back in, but I don't feel like we're my key debate thing here isn't even like I need to convince you that Donetsk must end its time. Like, my fixer's gonna lose his old home, right? It sucks knowing this guy who's I've gone into this shit, excuse my French, with him so many times. And he, like, every time he goes back to like the Donetsk region, I can see it on his face, that desire to go back home. And they're like, okay, you have to make this sacrifice. But then we tell them to make the sacrifice, and the Russians are like, cool, that's not enough. You need to give us XYZ. You need to demilitarize. These are demands that you and I both agree. Like, they would have to win those in battle, and demilitarize. That's suicide. That's national suicide. If you keep getting invaded, and then you were like, okay, I guess we don't need guns anymore. Like, it's ridiculous.
even
So
Japan has a
until the
security.
Russians wake up to reality, we need to make them wake up to reality. And the only way to do that, again, is by continuing to reinforce the Ukrainians and letting Congress do what it wants to do and has the votes to do. I'm not saying let the president do executive action, as has become very popular, and just to dictate the entirety of foreign policy. Let Congress debate it. Let the Senate debate it. I think if it was brought to the floor by Thune and Mike Johnson, okay, by MJ, that they would succeed. And so I don't see any other pathway outside of, I guess we're just going to lay back and, as President Trump put it, let the kids fight it out on the blacktop, which, okay, let's say we let the kids fight it out on the blacktop. What happens if one side actually
Let them
breaks?
fight it out.
What happens
What's
if
that?
what happens if one side actually breaks? What happens if one kid gets hit in the face, his head hits the pavement, and he starts bleeding out? What happens if the sagging that I see on like the eastern side of Pokrovsk or any of these other locations that I'm a little nervous about, there's a big breakthrough? And then the Russians start marching on big location. What do we do in that moment? How will the Russian public react to that? Will they react to that with poise, saying, now that we've won this war, we're going to settle in and never engage in revanchist conquest again? Or will the leadership say, this was a massive success? They know it was very difficult, but we learned, we expanded our armed forces. Now we can do it again. So for me, again, I don't see any other diplomatic option for the United States outside of a Korean War 1951 style. Look, until you're willing to play ball with us, we're going to keep murking your guys out in the field. And after Stalin died, the Soviets came, they negotiated, and we came to a settlement. Now, that's ultimately not my
like the Korean
ideal
War where we have a
situation,
demilitarized
but
zone.
this, if we want to achieve that, the Ukrainians have to be militarized. I don't see any other option.
Oh, that'll be forever. But like, no, you're actually correct. It's going to end like the Korean War, but we're going to have a demilitarized zone, and it's going to be this silly little line that we have to play political hopscotch around for the next 20 years. You and I are going to be older. Well, you're going to be a middle-aged man. I'm going to be an old man, and we're still going to be talking about, oh boy, the line in Ukraine, Russia. Oh my goodness. That we're going to be talking about that for a long, long time. And it's the unfortunate reality. But that will be the ultimate end of this war, is going to be closer to, like you said, the Korean War, where it's just this silly little line that we now have to worry so very much about. And that was my call I made the day the invasion started.
But I want to hear, okay, so the Korean War, I think that some of the comparisons make sense, other comparisons don't make sense. But I really want to get to my main point of, the Russians won't accept your deal. They look at your deal, they say that's weak, we won't accept it, which is what they're saying right now. Because that deal you said is essentially what Trump kind of offered. And you want to know what Trump offered following that? He said, you know what? They don't even need to join NATO. Ukraine's not going to join NATO. That's Trump's position right now. We'll let you keep all the land you got. Ukraine does not join NATO. Just accept it as it is, which to me is a bad deal. It's a bad deal because it's a deal that'll see the war start again in 3 years, and I'll have to come back here, and I don't want to. I mean, I want to come back here to vacation in the mountains and take shrooms. I don't want to come back here to play patty cake in a trench. Okay, it sucks. It sucks. You know, corpses smell like shit. Experience. And so so to me, if Russia is not willing to accept your, in my opinion, generous deal to them, where they get to, after all this, be able to say, look, we accomplished something. If they're not willing to accept that, then action has to be taken.
At that point, yeah, and what that would look like, I'm not
that
sure.
Point
but
was 150 days ago. That point is way past.
Now, do you think that American troops should be injected into this war?
No.
If things start to break down.
I mean, wait, it depends. For example, let's say we do this NATO thing and then the Russians invade again. Well, then NATO only works if we put our troops on the ground, right? I mean, why bring Ukraine into NATO if we're saying you're in NATO, but if you get attacked, actually, we're not going to say. NATO only works if the threat of us putting our troops on the ground deters invasion. That's how you can have a big gun and actually end up using it to, have peace,
But spare that, before, like pre-NATO, like say like Ukraine's basically just running out of people. They've got all the nice equipment that we've paid for, but
that's not true.
They're
but
running out of folks. Man, what's that?
The equipment stuff isn't true. I got angry at Hassan recently for this, because Hassan recently said having equipment isn't the issue. Horse hockey. When I
Oh,
went
there's
into,
no
let
such
me
thing
tell
as
you
enough
one
equipment
story
in
to
a
get this
war,
across
dude.
to you, right? Let me get
It
you one
doesn't.
story.
It doesn't exist enough equipment in a war. I will concede that.
Well,
Both
let me
sides.
just
There's
tell you.
no such thing.
Let me tell you the story quick, okay? I went
Rock and
into
roll.
the city of Pokrovsk. It is the most violent axis on the war right now, right? Or at least one of the two most violent axes. Getting into the city, we had to divert off the road, do the drone activity. When getting out of the city, we had 5 failed evacuations. 5, due to how heavy the drone presence was, FPVs, all that stuff.
What's a failed evacuation?
Basically,
I'm sorry, what?
a failed evacuation is, hey, we're about to go. Snap, we can't go. We can't go. There's a drone. That's what a failed evacuation is.
Oh, good
And we
lord.
have to wait another
Okay.
20, 30, 40 minutes until the drones are out of the area. Then we try again. It happened 5 times just on the way out, right? And then on the way out, we had another, we had to pull off the side of the road next to this burning building because the drones were patrolling. And during all of that driving around, I was in the back of a Toyota pickup truck. Meaning if the FPV hit the back of that truck, I'm done. There's no armor, there's no protection, there's no nothing. I've seen cars that you can basically say have the same defensive strength of a Beetle, of a the old Beetle cars being used to transport troops to the line of contact, to the line where people are exchanging some amount of small arms fire and mortar rounds. And the reason why is they don't have enough armored vehicles. They don't. And as that's happening, I know that the American Armed Forces have sent Bradleys here and they've performed amazingly well. I've seen footage of Bradleys taking out T-80 tanks, and that's not even something it's supposed to be spec to do. But that so many of these Bradley pilots know how to hit a certain spot because they played War Thunder so much that they know actually how to basically blind the tank driver and they crash it into a building. And these vehicles have performed quite well, and we're phasing them out. We're phasing out the Bradley. This is stuff that's going to only sit in American storage units for the next 30 years until we have to destroy it, and it could have a massive impact on the ground. And so I just want to be clear that any soldier that I'm talking to on the front line that drives around in one of these little cars when going to and from the front line, every single one of them would pick an armored vehicle from one of our supply depots over that because there is a shortage. And when we talk about manpower issues, equipment issues compound manpower issues. Because if you look at the Bradleys, their hatches are open when they're destroyed, indicating the crew got out. When you look at BMP 1s, they're tin cans. There's no open hatches, just graveyards.
Okay. So, I concede that there's no such thing as having enough equipment. But what I'm saying is, yeah, we've sent a lot there, but whatever you send is going to degrade because it's war. The whole point of war is to kill people and break things. And so,
And
yeah,
degrade the enemy more than you degrade yourself.
Yeah, and that's why I always say that war is more decay than it is endurance, because which side is going to decay less, basically. And so that's what I mean when I say there is a sacrifice because parts are going to decay away. And so the friend you're describing, he's probably going to lose his home. To me, the reason I want them to find some way to get to some stretch, some piece of Ukraine entering NATO, and then we'll negotiate the rest of it later is because yes, it's unfortunate and it's tragic that he lost his home, but he still has his life to build a new one. A farmer from Nebraska, and if you're going to tell me to abandon great grandpa's old river, I'd be like, okay, you can come take this land when you pry it from my cold, dead fingers, sir. So yes, I totally understand it, but that is the sad sacrifice of war. It's why I never wanted it to start to begin with.
I agree with you that some compromises might have to be made. We probably disagree about what type of compromises should be made in order for this not to happen again. I think that the Russians have to walk away. Honestly, my opinion is the Russians have to walk away from this feeling broken. That they have to view this the way that Americans view Vietnam. And that type of psychological impact is important to making sure that the Russian government can't so quickly drive their children into another machine gun nest. Is that you need to understand the cost of war that the Soviets had to process with the Soviet-Afghan war. And I mean, so I
Let me just
agree.
clarify, because
Yeah.
if there was whatever plans, if there's plan A, B, and C, and like B was your
Uh-huh.
plan, A was my plan, and C was somebody else's plan, and your plan of everything you just lined out was a path that we could actually get the bullets to stop flying and people to stop dying, and we could actually get to the other next steps we're talking about. I don't care which plan. I don't care
Mhm.
what
I have the
span
peace
of
through
land needs
strength
to be
plan,
given
by
up.
the way.
What's that?
I have the peace through strength plan.
Oh, that's fine. That if that's your perspective, that's okay. But like to me, it's like whatever we get to the end, like because a lot of these peace through strength plans are just a continuation, and it's just like we're just gonna
The war is going to
keep on
continue.
fighting,
This isn't a
fighting, like
question of whether the war is going to continue at this point. Only hope
at least for the rest of this year,
the well, yeah. I remember saying like 2 years ago, I think the earliest it
because
could
we
end is
funded it.
26, and I don't know how I made that prediction, but it I felt it deep in my soul, and it's apparently it was right. But maybe it'll be wrong. It'll be 29, 2030. You know, it'll all be robots and ground. A lot of ground drones are firing machine guns now. A lot of robots are doing the fighting. But again, the question
How
is
effective is a
yes.
12 gauge against
So
a
we both
drone?
agree that the war is probably going to continue. So the question is, how do we make the war end sooner? Right? That's the real question now. The soonest end to
Yeah,
the war. And the Ukrainians are not willing to concede river crossings. Neither should they, because that would be
okay.
strategic suicide. They're not willing to concede demilitarization, which we both agree
That is just one.
are things that makes
You got
no
the water
sense
to go through.
considering the current situation. And so we need to readjust the battlefield situation to the Russians are like, okay, fine, you can keep your guns. Fine, you can be in some strategic alliance that will stop us from invading again. Fine, we'll maybe have to make some compromises when it comes to all the land that we want to conquer, you know? And until we get to that point, we have to find ways to get them to that point. And I don't believe telling them either you're going to have peace, Russia, or oh, we have a big threat for you. We'll walk away. That I couldn't think of a bigger offer of my God, we did it. We outlasted the United States. Western degeneracy and weakness has turned its ugly head again. And now we've split the transatlantic alliance, which lasted since World War II. And now we can march forward towards our revanchist destiny. Right? I don't see that as a sooner end to the war. I see that as the drum beats in Russia getting louder, which I have seen tangibly on the ground through their expansion of the war, through the bombing last night, from the bombing from the night before that, and the bombing from the night before that, and the new offensives into Sumy, which I mean are there. I've seen the corpses that the Russians are losing. I know they're losing men. It's bad. So it's not like they aren't paying a high toll for it. This year, the Russians are losing more men than the year before. And the year before that, it was also a true thing. And the year before that, it was true. So in 2022, 2023, more men. 2024 lost more men. And in 2025, somehow again, they're losing more men than the last. So the Russians are continuing to expand the war. How do we stop that expansion? Make it so that they're running into a brick wall. And eventually, once you've lost a few teeth, you'll stop slamming your face into the brick wall.
And unfortunately, like we both pretty much come to the conclusion that that wall is NATO. There's really no other wall that really pushes Russia back. That's why they hate
Well,
it being
I
so
would say
close
the
to.
Ukrainians have been the most successful in pushing Russia back since the Soviet collapse, compared to the Chechens and compared to the Georgians, compared to the Moldovans. I mean,
Oh,
they are the
I'll
only
give you
nation
that.
state that has successfully held off this type of
For the
Russian
next like
invasion outside of what, Finland?
Yeah, well, for the next 2 decades in movies and TV shows, like the secret special ops military like badass guy, he's going to be Ukrainian. Okay, in all the movies. Okay, it's like, oh, this guy comes from Ukraine. He was a Ukrainian special forces guy. So that's going to be the metaphor in like really bad John Wick ripoff movies that are going to be. It's like, oh yeah, the Ukrainians don't mess with that. So yeah, they're going to have quite the reputation going forward. But to me, it's like, yeah, if we keep grinding it on, the men are all going to die, and the Ukrainians are going to lose their national identity, and then they're going to be replaced more or less by other people. Or if the where we sue for peace,
Well, but if
and
the
then
Russians
in the
win, they're
civic
also going to
sense,
lose
they
the
lose
national
their
identity.
national identity.
That's
So
part of their
one way
strategy.
or another, they're losing their national identity. So why not just end the war? Like that's the way I look at it. Unfortunately,
I mean, why didn't
is like,
I mean that's like but again, this is like it's 1943, and you're telling like the Soviets and the French, why don't you just end the war? It's because they don't want to end the war. They have no
Well, even
interest in
World War
ending the
II
war.
eventually did end.
Yeah,
Though
once
at one point the Nazis did have to sue for peace. So did the Japanese. At one point the Italians had to sue. The
but
Italians
the
weren't in
Russians are
nearly as
not at
bad
a
a
point
position
where
as
they're
the
willing to
Germans.
sue for peace. So my point is we have to get them to that point. And the only way you're going to get them to that point isn't going to be strongly worded letters or, wagging our finger at them or continuing to threaten action and then never pulling the trigger on it. I just want Trump to do what he said he was going to do. That's all I want. And I don't
Agreed.
think that's a
Why do you think they
ridiculous
voted for the
demand.
guy?
If Trump said he was going to surge aid, surge aid. If Trump said he was going to do these things, because if Trump keeps saying he's going to do things and then he doesn't do the things from a geopolitical opponent's perspective, he's just basically a guy with all bark and no bite. And how do you deal with a guy who's all bark and no bite? You basically ignore him.
Now, in regards to being the anti-war candidate and end the war, like, okay, a lot of my buddies, they voted for him exclusively because he was President Peace and he wasn't going to bring any new wars and he was going to end the war in Ukraine and he was going to, like, that was it. And they have been, needless to say, many of them have been sorely disappointed in the last week, and especially with this new Iran thing. And I want to ask you about that because, like, yeah, I mean, sure, you're not on the ground there, but like, you've been doing war correspondent stuff for like a couple of years. You probably know a bit more than me. I'm a farmer in Nebraska, so I haven't been like asking too many folks in the area or anybody would even know. But we've been very sorely disappointed with the lack of peace we've been seeing. And like, what's kind of funny is there's always this weird, like, well, hey, he hasn't started any new wars. The 116 wars we've had going on, those keep on churning on. But guess what, bucko? Number 117, that's a bridge too far. And so, like, that's the unfortunate reality is, like, we've been lied to so many wars now that, like, the American people are just like, nope, I don't believe any of you. The institutions have lied to us too many times. They've thrown us overboard. And so, nope, we don't believe you anymore when you say we need to, it's basically the boy who cried wolf. It's the government that cried necessary war.
I understand the type of apathy that can be inspired post Iraq. I've spoken to quite a few veterans about this. But a lot of Iraq veterans I know here, and they're here because to them, they said that this is the war that I thought Iraq was supposed to be. Oh, this is a fight for freedom that I truly believe in. And I understand somebody having some amount of apathy to it, but you can't like really just tap out of the world or tap out of the affairs you've entangled yourself into and just kind of cut your losses and run, especially if the goal is you want to have some amount of an impact. Trump says that he's the deal maker, he's the peacemaker. This was like his pitch, as we're seeing that he's saying like unconditional surrender to the Iranians, which they won't accept. And we know where the B2s are probably headed. But he sent himself as somebody who could, he's a tough negotiator, that he'll go to these two parties, he'll be tough to one side, tough to the other, and eventually he'll get a deal. And I've seen that toughness to the Ukrainians. The Yale program that was tracking the kidnapped, trafficked Ukrainian kids, that was defunded. The aid cut that happened, the intelligence cut that happened, the 20,000 drone interceptors as drone attacks are expanding, being diverted, which was already approved for Ukraine, being diverted to troops in the Middle East, or just the lack of response to U.S. citizens being killed in the country, to U.S. companies being bombed in the country when Trump's pitch was, hey, this mineral deal is going to stop the Russians from invading again because they're going to be so scared of bombing an American business. And Boeing just had its office blown up in Kiev like 2 days ago, right? And so I've seen the pressure on the
Did Ukraine sign the
Ukrainians.
mineral deal? I forget. Did they? Or?
Yes, they did sign the mineral deal.
Okay.
They gave
We
Trump the
got the
mineral
minerals.
deal. They did. They gave Trump the mineral deal. They agreed to an unconditional ceasefire. The Ukrainians agreed to that. They agreed to pay for future weapon shipments. They said, we want to give the United States $15 billion to buy new air defense systems to protect our cities because the war isn't ending and our hospitals or buildings are being bombed. We would like to shoot those out of the sky. I would like to see them shot out of the sky. Okay. Sometimes when these bombings happen, it kind of feels, I remember somebody saying it feels like getting dragged out for execution. as you listen to it get closer, and then you find out it wasn't you, and then you just kind of wait for the next one. And so the Ukrainians, they've gotten that pressure. They've gotten the pressure through aid cuts. They've gotten the pressure through having them try to compensate the United States through this mineral deal, and they've given Trump everything he wanted from them. And then you go to the Russians, and they've given him nothing. And all the threats, all of the pressure that he said he put on the campaign trail to make himself look like the big, shooting from the hip cowboy to his supporters on the campaign trail that, like, I'm going to get this done and they better get it done. Or, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. None of that has been delivered upon. It makes Trump look like he's phony. It makes the United States look like it's weak. And I see it as only something that can perpetuate the war and continue it. Trump is, through his own actions, or really his lack of actions, becoming the candidate of forever war, of continuing this war by not being willing to take the actions that are necessary to end it. Sometimes that peace through strength policy has to actually be brought to the forefront. It's not peace through, well, let's talk for another 2 weeks. It's peace through strength.
Unfortunately, it looks like about this time next year, we're probably going to find out whether this war is going to end or not. Because if the funding starts to dry up, the summer battle months, it's going to be.
Why do I have to wait
rough.
another year? Why can't Trump act now? He said he would. Every time he says 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks.
Because that's when the funding that Congress approved during Biden's term finally runs out at the end of this year. And so if my theory holds that our funding is what actually extends this war effort, then yeah, it'll be about this time next year where things are going to start to look pretty dire for the Ukrainian military because no new money is coming. Because every army, you need a lot of money, you need a lot of men, and you need a lot of stuff. And if any of those stop coming in, you got a problem.
From my perspective, this is kind of infuriating because I was told before he gets into office, he'll bring peace, because what the real problem was, we didn't have somebody in there that really would talk about peace seriously. Then it was 24 hours. Then it was 100 days. Then it was 2 weeks. Then it was 2 weeks. Then it was 2 weeks. And now it's like, well, okay, well, if we just let the bloodshed kind of go out for another year, then when the Ukrainians stop getting American aid and the Europeans will do their best to try to supplement the difference, then, as the front line starts to see some painful movement on the Ukrainian side, more people get hunted, more people lose their homes, more people blow up. Maybe then the Ukrainians will have to compromise. Compromise how? Allow them a river crossing? If we allow them a river crossing, we're just signing the death warrant of this nation. We're asking for another war under those
Why not
circumstances.
make the line the river itself? Kind of like how Nebraska has the Missouri River dividing us from Iowa. Why not make the divide where the river is itself?
Because the Russians are demand. That's the problem. You can't do it across the whole country. That would be giving them a bunch of land they haven't won in combat. But even if we just said where the river divides the armies now, the Russians aren't accepting that. They said they want to be across the river. They said they need to be across the river, that they need to take back Kherson because they got humiliated there, and they consider it a Russian city, despite what the locals say, but they consider it a Russian city. And so if these are the demands they're putting forward, what happens then when a year passes and the Russians say, great, they have less aid. Now it'll be easier to cross the river. That'll be easier to take Zaporizhia. Now we have war goals that are more attainable. Let's expand the war again.
Probably sue for peace while you still have resources and you still have time and you still have men. Like I keep saying, and you're not going to like this part because they're going to have to give up something significant. And yes, they're going to sue for peace, be that peace ever so base. And there's going to be a large chunk of Ukraine that ain't going to be Ukraine no more, but the war will actually stop, and then what is left, you can actually work towards being part of NATO.
The war won't
and that
stop.
Is the wall of
what
diplomacy.
You're citing for is multiple generations.
There is no
of
other
bloodshed,
option to actually get the killing to stop.
Dylan,
God bless you.
This is war through weakness, dude.
Forever. Like, God bless you, but that's what I'm hearing from you. Keep it going on forever till we can get a good deal. And
get a deal that is acceptable. The deal that they would be pushed in a year from now is going to be give up all your guns, give up all land that you haven't given to us, yes, including river crossings across the most strategically defensive river barrier between Ukrainian and Russian forces. It is basically signing the death warrant for a generation in 5 years. It'll just
Well, if
start
you're
another
saying that the
war.
deal they're going to
What you're
get in a
asking
year
for
from
is
now
not
is
a
going to be
continuation of
less,
the
it's
war of
going to be
one more
worse than the one
year.
they're going to get
What you're
now.
asking for is a continuation of war of 5 to 6 to 7 more years when the war launches again. It's I understand your
What if they
intention
were
here of
members of
not adding
NATO? I thought
fuel to the
we both
fire,
earlier
but
conceded that
sometimes
if what was left of
firefighters need
Ukraine became
controlled
NATO.
blazes to stop the spread.
Well, yeah, no, but I think we earlier both conceded that whatever part of Ukraine became NATO, that would be the wall of diplomacy. We did that earlier. Now,
But the
yes, it's
Russians
going to
don't accept that.
be
You're giving you're taking that as accepted. The Russians don't accept that. So how are we going to, in a year when the Ukrainians are weaker, get them to accept it then when they're in a better position?
They won't accept Ukraine into NATO membership because they're in an active war. And so
They
you
won't
end the
accept
active
NATO
war
in
whatever way
Ukraine
you
and
need
NATO
to.
ever. That's their position. They believed it before the war, they believe it during the war, and they'll believe it after the war.
Well,
When they invaded, one of the reasons they used was that NATO
NATO and
expansionism.
whatever's left of Ukraine.
What?
Well, they can protest it all they want. They can be as angry as they want about it, but that's between NATO and what's left of Ukraine.
Okay, but they're not going to end the war
If you
unless
can
that's
end
the
the
case.
war
If
in
they're if
whatever
Ukraine's in a
means
weaker
possible,
position, they're not
and
going to
yes,
be in a mood to negotiate better
yeah,
terms on the
eventually Russia's
Ukrainian
going to run
side.
out of fighting them too. Okay, and so it doesn't matter. Like this war is going to end, regardless of where it ends or why it ends. And what you're telling me is the deal that the Ukrainians are going to get a year from now is going to be way worse than any deal
If
they
they
could
don't
cut
get
right
more
now.
support,
That
yes.
tells you something. That,
If you
I mean,
give
sorry,
them the
that tells you
support that
they're
we
from a
placed the
position of weakness.
infrastructure in
The
place for,
difference
then we
between
can get a
surrender
deal that
versus
actually works.
like again, like I'm just like Dylan, and God bless you. And I know this is very frustrating to hear because you love these people that you've been embedded
Well, it's
with.
frustrating to hear
And
because
you've
you're
been
asking for more years of war.
no, I'm
You don't
trying
even
to
know
end
it.
it as
You
soon
don't
as
even know you're
possible,
asking for
and
more
then
years
put
of
what's
war.
left behind a wall of diplomatic immunity. Basically,
The
I know that's not
Russians
the right
will,
word, but they're
until the
behind NATO's
Russians
wall.
get a bloody nose that really hurts from slamming their face against the wall, they're never, ever, ever, mark my words, going to accept Ukraine in NATO, especially when Trump's already given it up.
Well, again, like I'm sorry, but like, do you recognize like the interesting position that you're in when you did concede that a year from now, Ukraine's going to get a worse deal if they were to cut a deal than they would if they were to cut one today in this year of our Lord 2025.
No, it's
That
going to be
means
the
that
same deal that they're offering right now.
I mean,
It'll
you're in
just be that they'll be in a worse position to defend against it. They're
Like,
offering the
don't get me
deal
wrong,
right
I
now.
hate this.
Demilitarization, Russian as the official state language, give up Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, and these are proposed as well as no alliances. That they
They're
have
not
to
going to
be
get
a
everything they want either.
neutral country,
Okay?
whatever the hell that
Keep
means.
that in mind. They're not going to get everything they want. Ukraine's not going to get everything they want. That's going
The
to be the
only way
ultimate
Russia doesn't get everything they want is if there's some counter pressure, which Trump is refusing to apply, and it seems like you refuse to apply, and you just kind of
Well, we've
hope
been
that
applying it
eventually, when
for almost
Ukraine gets
4 years,
battered
and it
enough,
hasn't worked.
like that eventually they'll
Like, we've been applying it for
acquiesce,
years.
but then
How many more years do we want to apply
they'll
this?
acquiesce on everything else, but somehow they'll get NATO
How
membership.
many more people are we willing to sacrifice for this? And I think we've sacrificed enough. And like I say, be it ever so base, it's time for them to sue for peace because we've been
Your
applying pressure to
sacrifice
them
will be
for years,
14-year-olds.
and it hasn't worked.
Your sacrifice will
Like,
be the 14-year-olds who are right now watching their houses get bombed, who are being brought up in an age of trauma, who then in 5 years will have to be the ones to fight the war when the war reignites. Because again, if the Ukrainians are in a weaker position in a year from now, because we've cut off all aid, we've cut off intelligence support, and we're no longer going to pass a sanctions package or whatever it is on the Russians, what's going to happen is the Russians in a year from now are going to think, of course I'm not going to let them in NATO. Why would we let them in NATO? They're in a weaker position now.
So I guess you should cut a deal.
The Russians don't want to cut a deal. Their deal includes no NATO membership. The thing you say is a precondition they don't accept now. Cut a deal with somebody who won't cut a deal with you. What does that mean?
Over and we can end the conflict. Then you can actually move Ukraine into NATO. Ukraine cannot join NATO because it's in an active conflict. So you need to
Trump
legally,
said he doesn't want Ukraine
by
in NATO.
international law, end the conflict whatever way you can get it done. It
Trump
doesn't really
said no.
matter how
He
you
said it was a non-starter.
Even if you have to leave some money on the table, then you can put up the wall. Then you can put up the brick wall that Russia will run into because they've never. Has Russia ever invaded a NATO nation?
No.
There we go. Past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. Might they do something crazy in the future? Possibly. But what you have to do is end the conflict by international law by any means necessary if you're getting a worse deal next year than you are this year. That's the unfortunate, very
But they
bad
will
position.
not
Ukraine, all of
accept
Ukraine's
NATO
choices are
membership.
fraudulent.
If Ukraine tries to join NATO, they'll immediately invade again. They'll say this is a violation of our agreement. We agreed no NATO membership. We're going to restart the war. And then when they invade, they're going to be invading past all the defensive lines that Ukraine made. Past all the defensive lines I've seen them dug on the Zaporizhia front, on the Donetsk front, on all these fronts, because they're going to have to give up those demands, because though that territory the Russians are demanding as a precondition to negotiate. So they're going to give up their best defensive positions, and then the Russians are going to be told, now you let Ukraine into NATO? Well, that's just not going to work.
If they reinvade, they're invading into NATO.
So you're going to say that we're going to just rush them into NATO behind the back door, as Trump says, no, we're not allowing them into NATO. He's already given that up. And Hegseth and all of the people around him have said no NATO membership. And we're going to get across Viktor Orban and all these other people because we need NATO
unanimity. Then
unanimity.
You're negotiating with the Russians. You got to say a lot of things, Dylan. Come on. You know that diplomacy is deception by other means. It is deception and seduction under another guise, as Benjamin Franklin once said.
So Trump wants to bring Ukraine into NATO. He just can't say it.
I think every U.S. president wants that, but they just can't say it publicly. It's kind of like saying, is Taiwan a country or not? They don't really talk about it, okay?
You don't think Trump, the guy who talks about being the peace candidate and always warned about the danger of World War III, you don't think that if
I'm president,
okay.
I brought the pieces. I'm sorry. If he could actually get the peace, yes, he would do it. By whatever means necessary, because the American public hates it. Okay. I mean, Dylan, you do have to consider
the American public does not, by the way. The American public actually largely supports Ukraine aid. You stand against the majority of the American public.
Well, the majority of the American voters elected Donald Trump.
That doesn't matter.
Largely for President
That's not matter on the position that we just discussed. And so, the American voters didn't vote on the Ukraine war. They voted on inflation. They voted on economic issues. Most people going to the poll, to be quite blunt,
it's a lot
don't vote on foreign policy.
Polls can be fudged
polls are wrong. They actually, when they tell pollsters, hey, we supported the Ukraine, that's all, it's just fake. All those flags are fake,
glorious, glorious flags. The great American flag. What country am I broadcasting from?
I don't know. A continental 1780 America, I guess.
Yes, nice. No, 1970s America. That would be the best, actually. If we could just get a Democrat from the 1970s, Republicans and Democrats would vote. But think about it. A 1977 Democrat would be perfect. But no, Dylan, unfortunately, this is one of those where not Carter.
You said 1977 Democrat. Carter's 3 years later.
Ouch. But no, you know what I mean? Like a Democrat from the late 70s who has that kind of like old school look on things before the Democrats kind of went loony on a lot of
President Carter, old school peanut farmer, wear sweater vet. You just keep describing President Carter, sir.
Oh, now I'll be honest here, just between you and me, this is a bit of a bird walk, but as a Republican and a farmer myself, I would have had a hard time not loving the campaign of Carter. Now, the administration was terrible, but the campaign, I'm just a simple peanut farmer from Georgia, and I'm a church going, I'm going to D.C., and I'm going to clean up that terrible town. Great campaign. I'm sorry, but he literally messed it up for farmers trying to run for office for the next 6 decades. No farmers run for office. But now, Dylan, we've been interrogating each other's stance on this, but I want to, if it's okay with you, I'd like to shift gears a little bit.
Can I just wrap this up quick?
Hey, please.
I try to engage in these conversations because I want to see if there's any other pathway to peace. And every time I walk away from these conversations, the conclusion I come away with is I don't see any other pathway, because even this plan that you're putting forward about waiting a year and seeing, and eventually the aid will run out. A lot of this is still dependent on the Ukrainians being willing to negotiate a deal that they still won't in a year. And it also is dependent upon them not believing the Europeans can pick up a certain amount of the defense slack, which they are to some degree, but they won't be able to pick up all of it. So it is true that there's going to be some extra pain if the United States does not engage. There's also, of course, the fear that I have for American credibility. We look like an uncredible power when we make a threat and then we don't deliver on that threat. Obama found that out in Syria, and now Trump is finding that out in Ukraine. But my main problem with all of this is not that I don't want peace. It's that we still have this belief that the Russians are going to be willing to compromise on NATO membership in a year, today, tomorrow, on any certain timeline. If they're the ones that they think the United States does not care enough to send aid, to send support, to get involved in any manner anymore, then they have no reason, no impetus, no pressure to make them accept NATO membership and not intervene and invade. And Donald Trump, the guy who said, he's scared of World War III, Tulsi Gabbard is releasing like World War III hype videos on her social media channels. It's really strange stuff, honestly. But it's like, we will all be covered in atomic ash. It's like, okay, Tulsi, reel it in. You're scaring the kids. But if that's the message of the Trump campaign, I don't see them going out there and rolling the dice actually on World War III, which you would be doing if you just say Ukraine joins NATO, whether you like it or not, Russia, now that the war is over, and Russia might then say, we're going to invade anyway. I dare you to nuke us over Kiev. You're not going to lose New York over Lviv, which is what the Russians might make the bet on. And I don't know if they'll make that bet, but there's a good chance they will in that situation. Maybe not drop the bomb, but if they invade after we've brought Ukraine into NATO, and then we're in the position of having to decide, do we nuke the Russians? Do we put our troops on the ground to fight the Russians in Kiev? If anything, this could entangle the United States more. U.S. Marines on the streets of Kiev dying.
It's a 50-50 shot at peace, admittedly, but unfortunately, the just keep the war going is a 0% chance.
Right? Which
it's
I
50,
think
50
an
or
aid
zero
package is a lot easier for the American people to stomach, which is why the majority of them support it.
I love you, Dylan, but what you're talking
World
about
War
is
III being a major risk. And I hate to be the one to actually come in here and doomsday about World War III, but the scenario you walked out is a real roll of the dice.
Yeah, it's either a roll of the dice on peace, or we just keep this war grinding, and then the Ukrainian men all eventually die off, and then we lose the Ukrainian national identity anyways. Like I'm sorry. Like, we have to end it one way or another. So eventually it's going to happen.
There's a post-Soviet demographic crisis in both Russia and Ukraine. They both have that pressure. I don't want their populations to die, but if you don't have a country to go back to, these people are not gonna. It's not just a question of, are these people dying? The Ukrainians have fought to keep 18 to 24-year-olds off of the draft rolls. They've made certain. They have. If you're between the ages of 18 to 24, you can't get drafted in Ukraine. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that is the case. They've kept certain strategic reserves of their population because they want to preserve the future youth of the country, so they have a demographic future. So it's not that they aren't taking this into consideration, but if the war just starts again in 3 or 4 years, or Ukraine becomes the atomic battleground by which NATO and Russia actually confront, then there's no Ukraine.
It already is. It already is the battleground between NATO and Russia.
There's no NATO-Russia war in Ukraine. They're not fighting. There's no German troops fighting against Russian troops.
Come on.
Do you not think that this war could continue to escalate?
Sort of like,
your imagination
like
is lacking.
A belt machine gunner, like a guy that's on a belt-fed machine gun, and he's firing off, and it's NATO that's holding the bullets, feeding it in, and like, come on, bro, come on.
Then America
this is basically all of NATO's shiny new toys.
Were there dying apparently because we sent aid? I mean, this is weak.
It's all of NATO's shiny toys and all of our money. And yeah, there has been some special ops that has been revealed from some Pentagon leaks to actually be about 100.
Well, if it's no different, then let's send the Marines today, K.O.E. to the shores of Tripoli, can be to the city.
They're lying about them being there. And then when it was revealed, they had to lie about like, oh, they were just there to watch embassies that we've already put out. Like, oh, come on.
Yeah, they were doing
We
training
get it. It's
operations.
war. Yeah, like
Why'd
but
you
yeah,
wink?
like to me,
That's
it
true.
is like
They were doing training
like to me, it's
operations.
like if it's revealed they're there and they lied about them being there, chances are they've been doing a lot of stuff there that they don't want the public to know. It's probably more than just showing folks how to aim rifles properly and use equipment. Like
Special
that's
operations training near the front line is extremely secretive, and it is part of what they did for both Ukrainian intelligence operations and its forces. I mean, that is something they didn't want the public to know about until it was reported by the press. They're probably also doing intelligence gathering. But I mean, like, whether or not they're doing special ops raids on like Russians' positions, which is I assume what like you're suggesting, that would honestly, I feel like that's just too
no,
high
all I'm
risk.
suggesting is they're far more involved than the like what NATO has nothing to even do with this.
Wait,
Well,
do you
it's one of those
deny
like
that the war can
maybe they had
expand?
no hand in it, but just a finger or two.
Do you
You know
deny
what I
that the
mean?
war could expand and if German, French, and American troops are on the front line, like hundreds of
It
thousands of them,
could
that's an
very well
expansion of
could.
the war?
We could also end it, like if we actually go by my plan.
Your
So it
plan doesn't
could.
end it. Your plan hopes that in a year they'll be too tired to keep fighting. That's not a plan to end it. That's a plan to wait it out.
No, that's a prediction. That's not my plan. That's just a prediction.
But your plan
Okay,
now
like
is to
that.
sue for peace, but the Russians still won't accept NATO
No,
membership.
my prediction is they're going to get a worse deal next year than they are going to get this year. It's not a plan. I don't want it to happen. Okay, it's just like it's like I'm not going to say inevitable, but it's highly likely. Okay, like I don't. I would much rather they get a deal now and we just end it and we can move on and Russia can more or less go home. Ukraine can get back to farming and we can stop all this silliness and horrible the horrors of war. But like it's worse than silliness. I'm sorry, I'm being too flippant about it. But that's so again, you're kind of conflating my predictions with my plans here, which fair enough, but
But
I
your
don't
plan is
I
to sue
don't
for
want it to
peace
happen.
with a party that's not interested in peace. It's less of a plan and more of like wishing on a
Trying to get
star.
peace amongst men who know only how to burn is very different. And so, like, yeah, we're gonna have to give up some things. We're gonna have to draw some hard lines somewhere, but there is gonna have to be concessions on the side.
I'm
But
not
now,
even against concessions, but the party that we're negotiating with won't accept the concessions you're offering. So what then?
then the battle lines are the new lines. Those are the new national lines.
But
Like, I
the
mean,
war
that's what happens when you
continues if
get
they don't accept
irretractable
the
war.
concessions.
What's that?
If the Russians don't accept the concessions in order to like allow NATO membership, which is the bet, we concede all this stuff. You know, I guess you want to make the Ukrainians withdraw from Kherson for this deal, which they're not going to do. But let's say we force them. We tell Ukraine, you either do it or we're going to invade you, or whatever we tell them, right? In order to do
But we
this,
don't
to
have
make
to.
that
We just say we're going to stop sending money,
okay, we'll stop
and
sending money,
then
and then the war will continue, and the Ukrainians will still. This doesn't. None of this is a plan to end the war. It's all. It all just seems kind of like, again, hoping that the Russians will see reason enough to just take what they got instead of reigniting the war and not reignite the war again down the line. And the only thing we're betting on for them not reigniting the war is a roll of the dice for World War III by having Ukraine join NATO after telling the Russians they wouldn't. And the Russians could only
so
expand to
you
that in one.
don't want
The Russians
Ukraine to join
only have
NATO.
one option to respond to that with invasion. In fact, I will
So
go
you don't
further and
want
say
Ukraine to
if
join
your
NATO.
plan was to go to fruition, Russia would just invade again. It would just start the war again. They would
They'd be
see
invading
an
NATO.
immediate NATO membership of Ukraine as too much of a
You see
threat,
the
and they would
new
invade.
variable. They would be invading NATO, though, which they've never done before for a specific reason.
If we're
So
able to rush Ukraine through the NATO confirmation
I
process
think we could make a couple compromises here and just
and get every single European capital, including Slovakia and Viktor Orban's Hungary and all these other states, to agree when they're all fundamentally opposed to the idea of Ukrainian membership in NATO.
On that lever once in a while.
And the Turks. What are we gonna do? Go fucking put a gun to the Turks' head? We can't just force the Turks to do this. We can't just force the Hungarians to do that. Definitely, if there's a coalition of 3 or 4 countries that are against NATO membership, it would have to be something that at least takes time to build consensus. And in that timetable, what's Russia going to do?
Oh, there's all kinds of ways you could make your way around. They've signed an interim agreement with NATO, and we're figure out everything later. But they're basically part of our new security agreement. Like you could really quickly force something through that would make it very easy for Ukraine to not have to worry about Russia from a NATO perspective. Okay,
Not have
so
to worry
no,
about Russia.
if you actually got them into NATO, okay,
The Russians would call bluff. I really think they would. I think they'd be like, look, this is a funny
we
scheme.
don't know that
We're going to
though.
invade anyway, and we don't
We
think you're
know
going
they're
to
going
do
to keep
shit.
fighting this
Because
war.
if the United States is not willing to send $80 billion to reinforce the Ukrainians to make the Russians feel pressure, why would they think we'd be willing to send our sons and daughters to die outside of Kiev?
Well, it sure seems that Britain, Germany, and the rest of Europe is just willing and eager to send their sons and daughters because they think this is such a worthwhile conflict. And so if they're actually in the alliance, it's a new wall. And again, you're saying they might, but they also probably won't.
I think they probably will.
Like more than likely, I'm going to say Vegas odds like 90-10. They're not.
I think
Probably
it's,
actually
I think it's
higher than
80-20.
like for peace 80-20. I'll take
No, 80-20 for
50.
war.
Yeah,
The Russians are going to call bluff. They're going to
pessimistic.
think that, wait, you guys who are not willing to send
So they're
aid,
going
you guys that we crossed
to a
every
non-NATO
single
nation.
red line, smacked you across the face, and you took it. You
It had nothing to
guys
do with
are going to
NATO.
send your sons
They're
and
not
yeah,
even an
fuck
ally.
off. They're not going to believe it. They're gonna
Like
say
Ukraine's
this
not
is
even an
complete
ally.
horse
Okay,
arson.
like we've sent them all this money, and
You
they're not
got to
even
make them
technically
believe
an
the threat before you make a threat.
ally. And yet, but again, like we talked earlier, Russia's never invaded a NATO nation, and Ukraine isn't even technically an ally. So they basically had an open lane to go in. This cuts that lane off. And it's the unfortunate reality. You're going to have to deal with an unwelcome amputation in Ukraine. That's the unfortunate reality. Ukraine's going to be fundamentally different from how we knew it 5 years ago. And it's a tragedy, but it is going to be a concession that's going to need to be made to get to peace. And that's, I know you and I are not going to, Dylan, and God bless you. And I respect your opinion on this because you're actually on the ground. It's just like this is the only way that I see going forward that isn't forever war, and I want it to end. Now I get that you're like, no, this is about it's about more than just the lives lost at this. Okay, there's a principle involved. Me, I've got a very old world way of looking at it where the lives lost are how I kind of measure conflicts. The new world way of looking at conflicts is, well, this is what was accomplished. Did we get the actual objective accomplished? And lives lost is kind of a secondary thing, unfortunately. Now, I get it. We're a world of objectives and what got accomplished. But to me, I look at the lives lost and I really, really question whether it's been worth it for either side.
Okay. I disagree. I think your plan would kind of just lead to a bigger war and it would go longer, but I mean, we obviously aren't going to see eye to eye to it on this.
That's fine. Now, can I ask a question though on the Israel-Iran conflict?
Sure.
Have you heard anything on the ground?
I mean, I know you're not. I'm not on the ground over there.
I'm sorry, bad, but like through the rumor mill, your rumor mill, given that you're actually like doing war correspondent stuff, would probably be a lot more accurate than mine.
I mean, the rumor is, American assets are moved into the region. Odds are we're gonna probably bomb the Iranians. I think. I mean, unless the Iranians are willing to make compromises that Trump recently said publicly equate to unconditional surrender, which I don't know if that's just him banging his chest really or what exactly that is. But I don't see a settlement in the near future. The Israelis say that there's no space for negotiation. And so it really would have to be up to Trump to be the one to either accept some settlement that is not exactly what we want, which might not be like, hey, they shut down all the reactors, might allow like a higher amount of like civilian nuclear activity. I don't know. But I don't see like that deal as being successful. I just don't see I don't hear anything about that success. And so I think the odds are that B-2 American bombers are going to be hitting Iranian nuclear facilities in the near future. That's not to say that it's inevitable, that it's 100% going to happen. But, I mean, I would say it's probably 60-40 or 65-35 because right now the Israelis say there's no room to negotiate. Trump's speaking like a warlord on Twitter. Absolute slaughter, unconditional surrender. He's that's not the language of of compromise at the moment.
Like that one guy we said, that guy, he died like a dog. Beautiful dogs, beautiful dogs. Like, yeah, sometimes he speaks in a way that's not, it's sometimes unbecoming a little bit. Like, here's the thing. I support the guy for the most part, but yeah, sometimes his personality quips like that aren't really necessary. But this is going to kind of decide his legacy, especially for people like me. We voted for him primarily for no new wars, okay? And if he gets us into Iran, this week is going to decide whether, like, as far as the right wing is concerned, is Trump going to be the best president of the 21st century, or is he going to be greatly punished in the eyes of the right wing? Okay, this week is going to kind of decide that.
Honestly,
I know it's going to be strange for you to hear he's already so diminished. But believe it or not, this is going to be the one.
Stopping deportations and all those farms, I'm sure, was what everybody wanted in the conservative movement.
It was. I've been joking with that with some of my buddies. Like, yeah, well, okay. Apparently Trump heard from enough folks from Iowa and Ohio that is like, oh, all right. I suppose not. But yeah, Charlie Kirk, and I don't think this is right. I would be shocked if he said that last month there was 0 illegal border crossings. He just tweeted that, and I said, I'm skeptical of that. But if you can even get anywhere close to
that,
the
government
if
said
that's
so.
True, Trump can basically spike the football on immigration. But the problem is he's a bit indisposed at the moment. He's got a couple of other concerns, specifically in the Middle East. Now, to me, this is the reality that I always keep in mind when it comes to either the Israel-Palestine or Israel and Iran conflicts and I always say to folks, don't look for peace. You ain't going to see it. There's not going to be peace in the Middle East until Jews and Muslims, Israelis, Palestinians, and Iranians accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, the one true Messiah and the only begotten Son of God, because only Jesus grants peace. So until that day, don't expect peace in the Middle East. So that's my my hot take on that one.
The Russians accepted Jesus,
and I hate seeing Christians tear themselves asunder. But
that implies that accepting the Christian faith doesn't necessarily mean peace. Christians can kill Christians. They'll find something else to kill each other.
There's people that can get it wrong, dude. Like, there's quite a few that do. And I would really wonder.
They have to accept your interpretation of the faith, then.
Christian ethics actually be?
So they have to accept your or my interpretation, or interpretation of somebody who's more pacifistic.
Well, no, it's sort of like how true is a promise that you keep. Like when you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, how true is it within you? I can't tell that. You can't tell that. It's only between you and the Lord. So, and even Jesus said, like in the Gospel of Matthew, he said, there will be some who say, but Father, we proclaimed your name, we prophesied your name and performed miracles. And he said, away from me, you who practice lawlessness, I never knew you. And so, yeah, for anybody that's a preacher or an elder, does ministry, that is the terrifying verse in the Bible.
So when they accept Jesus and have a strong personal relationship with them.
Yes. First, your salvation comes by faith alone. You're having faith in Jesus Christ. Then your justification comes from your works.
Because I know there are Russian soldiers who truly believe in their heart of hearts that they are fighting the Christian fight. They're fighting against like the moral degeneracy of the West, that before you know it, the LGBT or whatever, like Satanism, or it depends on whatever the state TV told you that morning, will come over and is going to corrupt Russian society through Ukraine. And you need to fight for your faith, XYZ. And if you ask these soldiers, when they start bleeding out on the field, they're praying. They think they're going to heaven. They think they have a strong relationship with God, and they did everything in his service.
If they've accepted Jesus, very likely. Now, thou shalt not kill. That's a problem.
But they're going to kill in God's name.
Well, no, as the book of Romans talked about how the magistrate does have the power of the sword in many instances, especially for like fair. So there are, I do suspect that soldiers, even in battle, do go to heaven if they die in war, if they've truly accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Here, let me put it this way: 2 Russian
My
soldiers,
belief,
2
if
Ukrainian
you're
soldiers.
just not to
One
interrupt you,
Russian soldier accepted
Mhm.
Jesus, the other one didn't. One Ukrainian soldier accepted Jesus, one Ukrainian soldier didn't. All 4 of them die. The 2 that accepted Jesus are getting into heaven.
So, but
That's
those
how
soldiers that are getting in the heavens still believe that they were going to kill in God's name.
you're not going to get into heaven based on how much truth you have in your head.
Well,
You're
my
going to be
point,
get
my
into
point
heaven based
isn't
on your
based
faith in Jesus
upon.
Christ.
Well,
You're going to think
my
about
point is that
wrong
I
things
think
about
that
this
the
world.
faith is not going to be the determining. Like even, I think that if a society accepted Jesus's values, which I've always found the most becoming, and the values that you're talking about, sure, but I just
I'm specifically talking about peace in the Middle East, okay, where there's always this religious warfare, specifically interreligious. Don't expect peace there until all sides accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. There has been peace in Russia and Ukraine. It's not right now, but there has been, and there will be again. In the Middle East, there's always going to be some sort of conflict popping off. There might be the legal peace that you can look at, like we're trying to finagle Ukraine into, but there's never that true peace we're looking for. So don't look for it, folks. Not going to happen. So that's my hot take on the Middle East.
I
That
think most
until
soldiers
all
go to
sides accept
heaven
Jesus, don't
regardless
look for it.
of their faith, honestly, because they've already seen enough hell on earth that to put them through another would be too damning.
Well, John 14:6, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man shall come unto the Father except through me. So Jesus has straight up said, you have to accept me in order to go to the Father. And
Yeah, that's
so,
what they
like,
wrote in
God,
the book.
every one of us deserves hell. You, me, everybody within the sound of my voice, we all hell. God could have only saved Abraham and he would have been totally just in doing so. But, like,
I mean,
because we
I
can
understand
accept
that's what
him
they
and
wrote
get
in the book,
salvation.
but I mean, seeing something and seeing somebody's soul
Well,
actually leave their body and reading something in a book that was transcribed by man claiming to speak to God, it's just I don't know if that's as convincing to me.
Well, I mean, that's the difference of when the Holy Spirit does a work in you. It's the difference between faith and doubt, more or less. Again, I'm not going to be able to convince you here intellectually of Christ because there's a saying in Cuba. My pastor does mission work in Cuba all the time, and the Cubans say you can't give God. There's no way I can give Christian belief to you. Okay, the Holy Spirit has to do a work. It's nothing that I or anyone else could ever do.
Okay, well, if you figure out a way to give it, you can send it to my PO
Oh, if I
box.
could, I would. There's so many people I would. Trust me. Trust you, me. One of my best friends, Tony G, that I do podcasts with all the time. He is not like he ain't down. I'll just put it that way. We have some deep, deep debates on it because
Mhm.
he's my best friend and I want him to be saved in eternity with me. Okay. And I want you to be saved in eternity with me too. Okay. And and everybody within the sound of my voice, I want that for you. And Dylan, I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to.
Do you really like me enough to want to spend eternity with me?
I do. Okay. Hey, God
I
loves
don't
you.
think I like
Okay.
anyone enough to want to spend eternity with them.
Wait until you're with Jesus. You're going to love eternity with. Trust me. Trust you, me, sir. Now, actually, I've been interrogating you a little bit. Is there any questions you got for me?
Honestly, we've been going for quite a bit now. I think like 2 hours. So I think
Nice.
it's probably good we put a cap on this.
Hey, Dylan, first of all, may I say thank you for this opportunity for me to come on with you this evening. It's been too long since we got to catch up, and I really enjoyed your perspective on this. And even though we might disagree, you're willing to walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. So I have tremendous respect, sir. Okay. And if we are ever in the same state, we need to share a beverage. Okay. Is it all right if I outro myself to the beautiful people?
Sure. The last thing I'll ask is, me and God haven't been on, I guess, the best of terms. So, if anything happens, you put in a good word for me. Maybe he'll reconsider.
Actually, let me say, last week at my church, we actually had a prayer circle, and we included you and your safe travels and your safe passage in our prayers. I put that in the prayer request, and we prayed for that. And yeah, sir, you are in my prayers until you get back home safe, and then after you get back home safe.
Yeah, I was about
Again,
to
you,
say,
like I said, you helped
I'm
me
gonna get
when
back. You're gonna
Oliver
stop, and then my
was.
house is gonna burn down again.
Well, yeah, like I'll bring an extra fire extinguisher, but but no, you, like I said, when my nephew Oliver was going through trouble, you helped out, man. Like you're you have good ethics within you. Okay, even though like our politics are completely off, there's a good man in there. Okay, so yeah, I don't know, like over the last couple of years, you've had a couple of controversies. I don't really give a I don't give a crap. Dylan's a good guy in my book. So, folks, as I'm known to say around here, all that being said, thank you for allowing me onto this show, you beautiful people. I am your King of Extreme, Phil K.O.E., the man of the hour, the man with the power, the band that makes you the podcast cover. You can, of course, find me at K.O.E. Nation on YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter. That's K as in King, O as in, oh my goodness, you can find K.O.E. Nation on YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter. E is in extremely happy to know you can find K.O.E. Nation on YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, and Twitter. Dylan, thank you. I'm never above shameless self-promotion. Folks, if you have not subscribed to Dylan Burns, you better do it, folks. It's the best place. What are you doing? You're leaving intellectual money on the table, folks. God bless every last one of you. I can't wait to see you back here, happy, healthy, much the wiser. God bless. Dylan, sir, take it away.
Have a good one, KOE. Take care of yourself. Stay safe.
Peace.